Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to warmly welcome you to IAP in the 6th arrondissement of Paris and to our global online audience. I'm Suzanne Grant-Lewis, the director of UNESCO's International Institute for Educational Planning. Welcome to the IAP Strategic Debate Series. In 2019, our theme is Breaking Barriers in Education. And we've been exploring initiatives, evidence-based planning, and policymaking that can open or close doors to equal opportunity in education for all. Today's seminar is the 5th and final one for this calendar year. We hope that many of you have been able to join us for previous ones. But if you haven't, I would really encourage you to go to IAP's YouTube channel where you can see the video. And once it's recorded, you can also get the transcript in many languages. We are live streaming the seminar today, and it's available in English and French. And lest I forget, I want to acknowledge our interpreters and thank them in advance for their great skill. So, as I said, this is the 5th in the series. In February, we looked at education for 21st century children with OECD's Tracy Burns and Rael Miller. In March, we looked at learning at the bottom of the pyramid, that is the learning for the most marginalized, with UPenn's Dan Wagner and Jordan Naidu. In May, we turned to the reform of the French secondary school and its flagship diploma program, and we're privileged to have Professor Pierre Mathieu and OECD's Paolo Santiago with us. And then just about five or so weeks ago, we looked at the Abidjan principles in taking the right to education seriously. And we hosted Sylvain Aubry, Delphine Dorsey, and Peter Colenso. So I'm very pleased to be here to introduce the panelists. Before I introduce the speaker and our discussant, let me encourage you who are physically present and those online to follow us on Twitter at IIP-UNESCO and hashtag strategic debate. But we're all connected. It's at Camilla Addy, no space, at Noah Sobey, and I'm the one with the underscores. So at Sue_Grant_Lewis. So today's topic is really compelling for IAP for a number of reasons. First of all, equitable learning is arguably the top challenge as we aim to meet the SDG 4. And assessment of learning is central to this challenge. But secondly, for more historic reasons, because IAP has a rich history in engagement in learning assessments, having launched a project in Zimbabwe way back. Some of you in the room remember this, in 1989. This project was to monitor the quality of education through student assessments. And by 1995, this initiative became a regional one and was launched as SACMEC, the Southern African Consortium for Monitoring Educational Quality. We led this capacity development program first and then later advised and hosted the secretariat, which took it over. We were very pleased to have it move into an independent governance structure with ministers in charge. And a third reason is that quite a few IAP staff have actually worked in this line of work in Francophone Africa, in PASEC, the Programme d'analyse des systèmes éducatifs de l'enseignement, which was also established back in the 1980s. And today, PASEC organizes international assessments for comparative purposes. Now, today, IAP's own engagement on assessments has evolved. Our main focus now is on the use of learning assessment data into policy and planning, into decision making. And we have both an applied research program to better understand inside ministries how learning assessment data is used and not used and what the barriers are to use. And secondly, we are supporting a number of countries in West Africa in what we're calling quality management, with particular attention to learning data at all levels of the system. So this is a topic that we're really engaged in, and we're so delighted to have Dr. Camilla Addy with us today to present some of her research. Dr. Addy's been co-directing the Laboratory of International Assessment Studies since 2013, which brings together experts from around the world involved in international large-scale assessments, also known as ILSAs, which you'll hear that term a lot. She's looking at engaging with international organizations, research organizations, universities, government bodies, private companies, and the media. Dr. Addy holds a PhD in education from the University of East Anglia and a master's from La Sapienza University in Rome. After completing her PhD studies in 2014, Dr. Addy was awarded a prestigious research fellowship, the Fritz Thyssen Foundation Fellowship at the Center for Comparative and International Education at Humboldt University in Berlin. And there she lectured and carried out research on global education policy. Dr. Addy teaches comparative education, and including educational planning, and some of us have spoken to her class, education privatization, and education data infrastructure. She's currently a Marie Curie Fellow at the Autonomous University of Barcelona. Her current research focuses on the expansion of OECD's global education governance, the contextualization of global policy tools in lower and middle income countries, and as well as the involvement of the private sector in ILSAs. Before obtaining her PhD, Camilla worked at UNESCO on adult literacy and non-formal education. So we're happy to have her back at a UNESCO institute. And she works in English, Spanish, French, and Italian, putting some of us to shame. But we are very pleased to have as our discussant today Dr. Noah Sobe, who is professor of cultural and educational policy studies in the School of Education at Loyola University in Chicago, where here Noah is also the director of Loyola's Center for Comparative Education. In the 2019-2020 academic year, he is on leave from Loyola and working with the Education Research and Foresight team at UNESCO. So he is working on this big initiative called the Future of Education. Dr. Sobe earned his PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's an active member of several professional associations and quite recently served as the president of the Comparative and International Education Society. He served for 7 years on the executive committee of the International Standing Committee for the History of Education. And with Iveta Silova from Arizona State University, he co-edits the journal European Education, which is the official journal of the Comparative Education Society in Europe. So we're very fortunate to have both of them with us today. Without further ado, I turn it over to our speaker, Camilla Addy.
Thank you so much, Sue. Let's see, I generally like to stand, but maybe I'll sit here to start with, so that the microphone picks my voice up fully. So today we're here the day before the PISA 2018 data launch, and this is purposefully organized so that we can focus not on what the data is saying, which tends to blind us, but on the politics of international large-scale assessments. As you will see from the title, we're focusing on the risks and benefits. It's actually quite difficult to claim universal benefits and risks for international large-scale assessments. So what I'm going to be talking to you today is about the meanings the ILSAs take on in different contexts for different actors. In other words, I'm allowing different actors in different contexts to draw their own conclusions in terms of what are the risks and benefits for education as they see. So the focus will be on the rationales for participating in international large-scale assessments and Just for clarity here, I want to say I'm going to be referring to ILSAs. ILSAs is the acronym that stands for International Large-Scale Assessments, and the most widely known one is PISA, but there are also many others, PIAC, TIMSS, PEARLS, and so forth. These are standardized international tests that are taken all around the world by students, youth, or adults, or in some cases, very little children. Another point I wanted to make is that my research has not focused on IEA and on civil society-led assessments. So the work that I'm focusing on is mainly OECD and UNESCO work in assessment. This does not diminish the role of IEA and of the private sector, which is contracted to carry out international large-scale assessments. And these motivations that we will be looking at today do relate to their work, to their ILSAs. And one point I also would like to make just before we start is something that we're reminded by in the work of Gordon Storbart in his recent 2018 book on the uses and abuses of assessment, that ILSAs, although they are seemingly outside the political system, actually are heavily value-laden social exercise activity. So the presentation that I'm today is focusing first on what has given rise to international large-scale assessments, so we understand maybe the broader landscape, what has created fertile ground for this trend, for this phenomenon to emerge so significantly. I then focus on the rationales of governments joining international large-scale assessments, mainly because this is what has been studied so far. What has not been studied, or we know very little about, is the reasons for which governments decide not to participate or they decide to withdraw. And equally, we know very little about non-government actors who put pressure on the decision to participate. So points 3 and 4 will be much shorter than point 2, which looks at the different rationales and the framework which I have developed together with Sam Seller on how we understand rationales for participation. And finally, some concluding thoughts. So what am I basing these, what are these claims based on? This is research I've carried out in Laos on UNESCO's literacy assessment for adults, known as LAMP, and also work I've carried out in Paraguay and Ecuador on the OECD's PISA for development. I also am drawing on work on publications that I've worked on with Sam Seller, which are listed here below, and the work of Sam Seller looking at PISA participation in Australia and the UK. These studies have all utilized a critical policy sociology approach, and I want to just specify a few elements about this empirical data. First of all, I have not focused on how governments use international large-scale assessment data. I have always focused on the rationales for participating. The data was collected during implementation and not once the data had come out, in part because this indicates how it's intended to be used, but partly also because participating itself, as we will see, is often one of the the way in which ILSAs are used. It's not so much the data, it's the participation that is used in ILSAs. Interviews were carried out with very high-level people working in government, so either in the government or directly in the various bodies of the government in power. And although I focused on lower middle-income contexts, I have talked and observed, and Sam Seller has worked in higher-income contexts. What is interesting is that I've often been asked, are the rationales for using ILSAs or participating in ILSAs different depending on the category of economic development? And although scholars have tried to suggest this, that, for example, low and middle income countries are participating under the pressure to obtain aid, actually, my empirical work does not substantiate this claim. Finally, 2 points. Although I'm talking about governments of Laos, of Mongolia, and so forth, I'm not considering them as monolithic entities, but actually here, these are representations of the perspectives of the multiple actors who I've interviewed. You will also see coding under some of the interview extracts. These stand for the country, the year, and a randomly assigned number. So what has contributed to the rise of international large-scale assessment? Over the last 20, 30 years, the growth of international large-scale assessments can be explained as a togetherness of many different changes that have occurred. First of all, I like to talk about the shift in assessment cultures. In the 1980s, there was warning against or suspicion of international comparisons of microdata about performance. And we have now, there was what has been defined as philosophical doubt about it. We have now moved over to statistical certainty that we can measure, we can compare, and we can use this data to take decisions. There is beautiful work by Kirsten Martins, Oren Pismani-Levy, and even Stephen Heinemann talking about how this shift occurred, in particular at the OECD and the IEA. And what this shows is that it's not the philosophical nature of the debate that has changed, but the political will. So another element in this changing landscape is new modes of governance and also a growing increased accountability of the public sector. This, in particular, I'm relating to the deterritorialization and the rescaling of education policy processes, but also the shift towards, or the shift from recognition and trust in professionals, for example, teachers, to a recognition and trust in accountability mechanisms and numbers. Related to this is the spread and the consolidation of this policy idea or this new way of managing the public sector, which is new public management, by which you have states which are more autonomous and decentralized, which steer at a distance through regulatory tools and rely on measurable outcomes. You can see this creates a very fertile ground for ILSAs. We also see education increasingly framed, especially after the fall of the Berlin Wall. We see a single process of economic globalization where education is increasingly understood, framed, and acted upon as an investment, as an economic resource. After the end of the 1990s, we also see a new consensus around the need for global goals and therefore also targets and measurements of these targets, which has created the need for more data, more targets, more international large-scale assessments, if possible, especially in the case of the Sustainable Development Goals. There's a a credo in evidence-based policy, a shift in aid towards results-based funding schemes, a learning crisis narrative. I would underline the word narrative, which we might ask ourselves, whose interest is this narrative in and who creates it and why? But this doesn't explain it all. There's more. And what I'm trying to say here is that there are many different factors, including growing economic competitiveness and economic vulnerability, growing processes of standardization in education, a growing state of education becoming a transnational market and so forth. All of this is feeding in to international large-scale assessments rising, but at the same time, we cannot disentangle it from international large-scale assessments themselves are also feeding in to these processes. Okay, so with this as a backdrop to the way we see what has created a fertile context for the growth of international large-scale assessments, it's now interesting to see the different reasons why governments have decided to participate in ILSAs. Now, here I'm presenting to you a framework which I have developed with Sam Seller from Manchester Metropolitan University. And what we look at here, this is an inductively developed framework that draws on all the rationales that we have collected through our work to try and understand how can we make sense of this? How can we analyze these different rationales? What's important to state here is that ILSAs mean different things to different actors in different contexts. They also mean different things at the same time. So ILSAs are not, Governments do not participate in ILSAs for one particular reason, but for a multiplicity of reasons. And those reasons change over time, even within the same implementation. These rationales are closely interrelated. The ones that we have divided by technical, economic, political, and socio-cultural actually, in some cases, are overlapping and difficult to differentiate. But what's important is that ILSAs, as an extremely standardized policy tool, take on extremely different meanings and are localized very differently. It's also important to note here that non-participation is not always an option. So in particular, talking to high-level income governments in high-level income contexts, economic status and membership in international organization imposes participation. And then finally, my work, although international ILSAs and participation in ILSAs has been looked at through different theories in global education policy, my work has drawn on policy borrowing and lending to understand why and how ILSAs are adopted and what meanings are given to them. So the first rationales that we are looking at, technical rationales, are related to the rigor and the robustness that is associated with the methodology and the data of international large-scale assessments, highly regarded as golden standards, as if everything else were not a valuable way of evaluating education. What's important here is that I would say most representatives of governments that I've talked to have talked about the reason to participate being the need to acquire these sophisticated methodologies in assessment, large-scale assessment, both in the development of them, the implementation and the analysis of the data. Be it higher income, lower income countries. In fact, I remember somebody from France telling me this was one of the main reasons for which France participated in PISA at the beginning. But it's also a way to access the materials, so the conceptual and the methodological frameworks, and not least access to the software. So as part of the package with an ILSA, you also acquire the software which you use to analyze the data, to develop the test items and so forth, which is problematic, especially with low and middle income countries, because you acquire this capacity, but actually then you can't use the software because it's far too expensive to buy. And this brings me to the extract that follows, which is from an Ecuadorian interviewee talking about the process of PISA for development learning, but also other regional assessments. Look at the case of Guatemala with TERCE, the regional assessment of Latin America. They are part of the loads of capacity building sessions. And then a whole set of things happened with the president and bang, the minister changed, they all left, the whole team was gone. So other issues with capacity building in ILSAs, not only is the software extremely expensive and not acquirable in many cases once the ILSA has been implemented, but actually there is also issues with retaining that capacity. I've often been participation has been justified as a way to shift from curriculum-based assessments to skills-based assessments, and this reminds me in particular of the case of Paraguay. And also, especially as ILSAs move into lower middle income contexts, ILSAs become a substitute for non-existent or for poor quality national large-scale assessments, which is, as we will see later, slightly problematic. Other rationales that have driven, technical rationales that have driven governments to decide to participate is this idea that you can legitimize national assessments through international large-scale assessments. This is interesting in the case of Ecuador. The closeness of the national and international assessments will give legitimacy to our national assessment. The idea that they were going to be able to state, I don't know if they were actually going to do it, but that they had acquired the skills from the OECD, the methodology, the conceptual frameworks, and they were now using them for their national assessment, was legitimizing what was being done at a national level. To benchmark progress in particular against particular education systems. So it's generally not an interest in against everybody, but specific countries are interested in other countries particularly. This, I would say, is something that has been shared with me in any country where I have carried out interviews, and this search for what works. And finally, there is an encouragement to link national and international large-scale assessments. It's one of PISA's long-term objectives is to create linking methodologies and to teach national assessment institutes how to link these tests together. And finally, finally, assessment experts and also policymakers in education have often suggested that this is a key space for sharing expertise. The next set of rationales that we will be looking at are the economic rationales. These are related to the hegemony of human capital theory in education and the closeness between that has been created, a causality and predictability that has been used to present performance data and economic growth measures. And just in relation to this, let me show you an extract from 2010 from the OECD, in which they state that a modest goal of having all OECD countries boost their average PISA scores by 25 points over 20 years implies an aggregate gain of OECD GDP of $115 trillion over the lifetime of the generation born in 2010. Bringing all countries up to the average performance of Finland, OECD's best performing education systems in PISA would result in gains in the order of $260 trillion. You can see a very clear, simplistic analysis of causality, predictability of performance and economic growth, which is the way many government representatives do frame the way they understand their participation, in particular in PISA and adult literacy assessments. It's also often used as a way to attract international but also domestic investors. Here it reminds me of the experience of the UNESCO Institute for Statistics had interest from Vietnam to participate in LAMP, and it was clear that they wanted to demonstrate high-level skills in their country, and the non-flexibility from UIS in the sampling led Vietnam to withdraw from participation in LAMP in 2012. Also to access aid or to demonstrate accountability and transparency in the use of aid. Here we see there is choice to participate because it's a way to access aid, but it's also under pressure, as we've seen earlier, funding schemes now attached to results based on, in some cases, international large-scale assessments. And then finally, this is an example from Paraguay, where funding was received to fund PISA, but actually part of that funding was used, and it was the intention of the government to use that funding to cover the everyday costs of running the ministry because it was under-resourced. So I now have an example from Mongolia, where you can see how a multitude of economic rationales that are driving their participation, in this case to participate in LAMP, where you see an economic framing of education, but you also see participation as economic competitiveness, as a way for attracting investors or demonstrating to investors what's available, and also as a way to identify how to prepare students so that they will be globally competitive. As you can see, it's entirely framed by this economic rationale and this idea that PISA, or international, in this case it was adult literacy assessments, is framed as an economic, the skills are framed as an economic resource. We saw the Mongolian skills were lower at the end of secondary school, but we need to be like European students. Mongolian students need to be globally competitive. There is huge foreign investment here. Investors want to recruit, but our skills are not at level. We really need to look at where we are in the world. So you can see in just one sentence how many different rationales are grouped here. The next set of rationales are related to pressures that are from domestic politics and international relations. These are closely associated with the socio-cultural rationales. What you see here is the use of ILSAs, not the data, but the inferences from the data, the analysis of the data, but the actual the rankings, the declining, the going up and down in the rankings, the top performers influencing those even who are not possibly not even participating. So you see ILSAs being used so that they can push reforms or to legitimize certain reforms. And what's important to say here is that for example, in the recent study by Fishman and his colleagues, a paper published in 2018, they carried out a study to understand what impact are ILSAs having on policy. Can we actually say that there is an impact? And they claim that it's problematic and inconclusive because ILSAs have become just, and here I quote, one more string in the complex web of pre-existing or emergent policy movements. So we can't extrapolate it, but yes, it's used to push and to legitimize policy processes. We also see governments using it as a way to develop, to gain political support. And this was presented to me in particular in the case of Mongolia, where there were numerous government changes going on, as a way to change the problematization of education policy and political narratives. For example, in the case of a number of countries was trying to shift away from the problem of having illiteracy as a problem and shifting to lower levels of high and low levels of literacy. And finally, and this is very important for many countries, demonstrating nationally and internationally that they are transparent and accountable. And here there's one of my favorite interview extracts, which actually picks up on all three of these: winning political support, changing the policy problematizations, and also demonstrating accountability, which is from an interviewee in Laos. We feel we are fighting with the villagers. They don't want to study, but we have to achieve our literacy goals by 2014 in a hurry. We will officially declare district by district to have completed primary non-formal education by 2014. The president will stand in New York at the United Nations General Assembly and say, my country has completed non-formal education and it is 98% literate. Here we see also something that we're going to look at in the next part, which is a sort of transnational accreditation of what's being claimed. And another example of transparency and accountability is from Ecuador, where the President Correa had been in government for 10 years. A minister said the best scenario is to take office in the ministry the day after PISA results, so day after tomorrow, and to leave the day before the students take the PISA exams, so a very short mandate. But we are taking the risk. In other words, we are showing ourselves in the public arena because it is going to be about our administration. The kids who are going to be assessed will have been students during the whole Correa administration period. So if they don't know anything, we have not taught them anything. They cannot blame anybody but us. So you can see now how they are. Also, there was, to a certain extent, a little bit of suspicion about some data and the sort of murkiness of the government after being there for 10 years. And so they really were seeking transparent outsider data, because national data can always be accused of being biased by the government. And then we come to these final essays. How long have I been talking for? Doesn't say. How much time do I have? Okay. Okay, 10. Okay. So The next set of rationales, socio-cultural rationales, are closely related to political rationales. Here we see what I have called the global ritual belonging, in which governments try to make a statement of alignment with the values of the international community, or as a mechanism of stating which economic or political affiliation they belong to. Here we have I have many examples, but there's a particular difference here where you can see a participation in an international community, or participation specifically in the PISA community, which is becoming more and more valued. And finally, also, there is a certain amount of peer pressure, but also this idea of obtaining transnational accreditation. Let me show you some examples here. This is the case of a description, before you read it, a description that was given to me about the entire PISA D process, in which 7 lower middle income countries were participating, and how they chose whether they would allow the instruments to be adapted more to their context to reflect their realities, or whether they were going to use the data, they were going to use the participation in PISA as the valuable element. It's as if you have all the freedom in the world, but with limits. You cannot play with that much. And these limits are not only OECD imposed limits, the countries impose them too. You take part in PISA because you want PISA. It cannot reflect my reality much, but I can sacrifice that. And yes, many things countries wanted were omitted. At the end of the day, you need to decide what you prefer. And what was preferred by all of the countries involved was to have a stronger tie with PISA. So you can see here a need to participate to this global education space created by PISA. Another 2 extracts here where a sort of almost desperate need, a global ritual of belonging, where not having a number, not participating, is almost the equivalent of being non-existent or not, just being backward. I don't think there is any explicit sanction, but there is a connotation that one is outside of something. It's like the feeling of being auto-excluded. Not being on the information map in the 21st century is unbearable. So here you see a statement of which community you become part of. And again, also another one from a high-income country in Europe, which was not participating yet in all of the international large-scale assessments, and then decided to take every single one of them. You see a case of peer pressure, global ritual of belonging, but also sort of symbolic transnational stamp of approval. If you don't have data from international assessments, it feels bad and it looks bad. You are just an empty line. It looks like you are not doing anything in education. And just to conclude, a few more of these rationales in ways in which ILSAs have been used, we find pressure to participate as a way to enter, to gain access to economic, political, and trade entities. So, for example, countries that are trying to become part of an economic organization will find themselves participating in an international large-scale as a statement of valuing that, their activities. As signatories to global commitments or as a responsibility in pledged activities. So, for example, in the case of Mongolia, they had pushed for UNESCO to develop a literacy assessment, and then they felt that they had the responsibility to take part right until the end, whatever the problems. As a nation-building narrative, or to legitimize national existence, especially in the case of, let's say, vulnerable states or newly formed states, or to enhance subnational autonomy. So where countries are trying to take PISA within a federal state, they take part in PISA or in another, in an international large-scale assessment to sort of put themselves there as a sub-entity next to all these other recognized states. Let me give you an example of nation-building narrative or the legitimizing national existence. An interviewee working on Palestine's participation in LAMP. The rationale for participation is obvious. It is part of the nation building. It was to put Palestine out there. We have LAMP, etc. Therefore, we must be a country. They did it very, very quickly. It was part of this. It was time to be part of this. You can imagine for a country to have its name and to not be an empty line, is in some way a demonstration of existence. I have similar reports from the participation of Kosovo and Cyprus in PISA. And then finally, for example, Senegal is using the participation in PISA as a demonstration and part of their becoming a middle-income country by 2025. So it's often also associated with what category of development a country is. And then finally, but not least, I want to put the focus on the interest of individual key decision makers who take part in the process of deciding that the government is going to take part in ILSAs. And this is from work done with Brian Maddox on how international large-scale assessments assemble validity, and where we look at key decision makers who are pushing for participation, in part for intellectual curiosity, professional networking, career building opportunities, international travel, which is part of it, and not least, the elite network which you become part of. It's opportunity, it's luxury, it's prestige. It's a very fancy world in some way, the ILSA world. Let me give you, I think I have another example here that I wanted to share with you. No, that was it. So we've studied governments' rationales for participation because it appears clear that they are the ones who are taking the decision. But in the new modes of governance that we see today, there are multiple actors taking part in these decisions. And so it's important to consider, and this has been basically not studied, the role of the media, public opinion, and special interest groups. So, for example, in France, the banks got together and put pressure on the government to take part in the financial literacy section of PISA because they wanted to demonstrate the levels of students or financial literacy. There is also so it's either used to hold governments accountable or to put pressure. The private sector. There is a private sector which is contracted to carry out international large-scale assessments, who obviously have an interest, in part because the greater the number of countries participating, the greater the economic returns. But actually there are other issues that are at stake, and it's not just about returns. It's also about global visibility, which an ILSA gives any company working with an ILSA, product development through the experience that they're were having because of ILSAs, access to network, but also the making of these new education markets, which is similar to the interest of the private sector, which I've separated here, which is not contracted. But this private sector, in the case of Paraguay, for example, put enormous pressure on the government to participate because they were interested in holding the Ministry of Education's accountable, in the sense that they claimed that too many of the employment was given by political appointments, and that actually by having to implement something as difficult as PISA, they were going to be recruiting more technical staff. So it's also, in this case, a way of holding governments accountable. Bilateral donors, development partners are putting pressure, as we've seen, attached to funding schemes. Philanthropic foundations who have interest in putting pressure on the governments or shaping policy. And also international organizations themselves have an interest. We've seen how the OECD was put under pressure to develop an indicator culture, which has ended up being its very well-known ILSAs. But actually, it allowed the OECD to find a new role for itself and other organizations to claim a voice in the setting of the global education agendas. It allows them to spread policy ideas, to have a greater impact on policy, and so forth. There are other actors who have not been studied at all: civil society coalitions, social movements, professional associations, investors who are playing a growing role in education. So there's a lot we don't know about, but their roles are not least important. It depends on each context. Finally, let me say that there are many rationales for non-participation. These have not been studied. And we have tried to group them together with Sam Seller under the different framework dimensions. We've looked at technical, economic, and political and social cultural. What we've seen is Technical, in many cases, it's an issue of the technical capacity, the resources that are required, but also as ILSAs have become sort of spread across the richest countries and maybe the countries with least vulnerabilities, now there are issues for countries to let's say a lot of the remaining countries who have not been able to participate actually are vulnerable states or countries where there is conflict or disaster affected. This is not to say that there is not actually a decision to not participate. Interestingly, here is a lack of ownership. When I was carrying out interviews in Mongolia, the government withdrew from TIMS because they felt that it was being implemented by the World Bank and not by the government, and they wanted to have ownership over what was happening. Economics, so it's very resource intensive, especially in multilingual or sparsely populated countries. There are other educational priorities. In the case of South Africa, which withdrew, if I'm not mistaken, from TIMS, the idea was that it was not providing them with the information that they needed. Political, this reminds me of the case of Bolivia, which claimed that ILSAs would not value diversity, local context, and holistic education in the way in which the government is implementing its educational program. I won't go through all of these, but just to say there are many possible reasons, but actually it's very poorly studied. We don't actually know why countries are withdrawing. We don't know why countries are not participating, and to understand this would certainly help us understand how countries are using them. And finally, let me conclude with a couple of thoughts. We might say the ILSAs basically mean anything depending on the context or the actors who are involved. It means different things. Great. So it's not hegemonic. But actually, what I'd like to argue is that the very versatility of ILSAs, these very different meanings that they acquire, allow ILSAs to grasp hold of education. And the ways in which education quality and equity are measured in ILSAs, although they highlight them, the problem with becoming dominant and hegemonic is that they render invisible all the other educational qualities and equities that exist that are rendered invisible in the current ILSAs that dominate education. In other words, they discriminate. So anything that dominates will discriminate what it renders invisible. And what I'm trying to say here is that alternative forms of assessing education qualities and equity should be equally considered golden standards, because they allow a depth and a breadth of education assessment that ILSAs in this case are not allowing. And then finally, I wanted to come to the work of Radhika Guru, and in the line with sociologists of quantification and measurement and numbers, to say that what these sociologists, in particular the work of Guru on ILSAs and indicators and standards and so forth, remind us of is how numbers and measurement are performative and normative. They bring worlds into being and they create ideals for these worlds. And this grasp that ILSAs have, even though they mean different things, means that at the same time, they are actually transforming the world. And this is to end with a beautiful sentence by Guru in which she asks, what kind of worlds are we bringing into existence, are being brought into being, and what worlds do we want to create? Which is something that we need to keep in mind as we think about the way we think of education, the way we're shaping it. And then just one final slide to pick up on the work of Laura Engel and David Rutkowski. In 2018, they published a paper on, is it worth it? Is PISA worth it? Basically, on the basis of their cost analysis of PISA participation in 2012 in the United States, they considered that the costs include a participation fee, which is very high. In the case of the United States, for PISA 2012, it was $1 million per year for the 3 years, plus $6.7 million implementation costs over the entire cycle, plus resource costs. This is students' time, teachers' time, and so forth. Their question is PISA worth the inferences for the data from the data for policy and practice? And what Sam Seller and I have tried to respond is different perspectives will have different estimates of worth. What we are arguing is that to actually estimate what the different costs and benefits are, we need to also consider the multiple rationales that are driving governments and other actors to participate in ILSAs. And so my final question for you today is, tomorrow we're presented with the PISA data. How do we read the data differently and the rankings and the nicely packaged data differently on the basis of a deeper understanding of the politics of ILSAs? Voilà.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Camilla. I'd now like to invite Noah Sobe to share his comments. Noah?
Have I done this right? Sounds like it. Excellent. Well, thank you very much. That was an excellent presentation. It's a real honor to be here. I regularly tune in online to these debates, and I've been lucky to be here in Paris for a couple of them. I really appreciate the way the IIEP brings together different kinds of expertise and activates some really fascinating conversations. I'm going to try and respond directly to your last question. And I was scribbling and reorganized so hopefully it all fits together. But the timing of this is on the one hand quite intentional, but also quite useful. When the 2018 data are released tomorrow, we can expect, firestorms of news coverage and politics. We can expect scandalization and hand-wringing and, ministers having to write awkward memos. It's possible that there might be some pride and satisfaction, although that's interestingly hard to find in the PISA reactions. But no doubt the sort of political fallout of these the data release we can expect tomorrow is going to be intense and interesting. And I think what Camila importantly has just shown us is that the politics of this began long ago, right? The politics began long before the data gets released. And I want to sort of expand on that, play with that idea a bit. I think we've just gotten a really useful and important set of insights on what her and others' research shows about the reasons why governments might or might not participate in international large-scale learning assessments, ILSAs. And of course, one of the major things we learn is that there are multiple reasons for participating in an international large-scale assessment. Similarly, for not participating. So I want to play with, what does this mean? That there are multiple reasons. Something you were engaging with towards the end of the talk, Camila. So you referred to this phenomenon as polyvalence, sort of the multiple framings and meanings that are attached to and that inspire an inclination to a desire to participate in an ILSA or not participate in an ILSA. I think what this raises, as you said at the very end, is the question of how to balance this multiplicity of reasons with what we know is also a very standardizing, universalizing dimension of international large-scale learning assessments. So on the one hand, we can say there is no universal PISA. There are lots of different national experiences of PISA. But this doesn't mean that there's no universalizing or standardizing aspect to PISA or to other ILSAs. So I'm going to play with that, kind of work on that axis for just a couple more minutes and then turn it over. At the very beginning, Camila made the observation that assessment of any kind is a value-laden social activity. And from what I see, I certainly agree with that point. I think it's a point that needs to be made. The argument that assessment is simply a technological, scientific undertaking, and that it's only when we decide what to do with the results that politics enters just simply doesn't hold up. I mean, one simple way to say this is that what is measured matters, right? We see this, whether it's with national assessments or international assessments. What is measured matters, or what is measured comes to matter. So PISA, like other ILSAs, are value-laden activities. So if we can agree on this, I would just simply add, yes, that's the way it should be. Accepting this point can help us get into a deeper conversation about what it is that we actually want to be doing. The question from Radhika Garor that Camila quoted at the end. What visions of society and of the purposes of education should be guiding us if we have that degree of freedom in the way we're acting here. So there are a whole set of values and visions across the different rationales that Camila so nicely just discussed. And I think it would be a mistake if we said that the technical or economic rationales are any more or less pure than the political or socio-cultural rationales. In all of these cases, we have the enactment of values and principles. And I suppose my argument would be that the more explicit and reflexive we can be about those rationales, the better off we are. I'm going to focus in on one that Camila highlighted. It's the ritual of belonging idea, right? I think this is one of the really key things she's brought into the conversation. So this is to talk about the enacted choice of participating in an international large-scale assessment as a statement or gesture or act of alignment, a demonstration of international belonging, of membership, of legitimacy. And, you know, it's common in a lot of the, I was going to say academic, but it's an idea that goes well outside of academic literature, to think of globalization as something that comes in from the outside, right? Globalization is this reaching in by some force or process that's outside. Certainly this happens. But I think we also can't lose sight of the ways that globalization can also be a reaching out, like a projection and a connection to an international order, to global trends, to global processes, phenomena, to kinds of inclusion in conversations that Camila was showing this. Because I think she shows convincingly that the global assessment order is partly, perhaps profoundly, produced through these processes of reaching out, of actors performing a ritual of belonging. And maybe this is the point to just recognize, as she does at the end, that it's not just state actors that perform that gesture, that ritual of belonging. You know, she talked nicely about the rationales of other key actors, and clearly you have to extend this concept of polyvalence to them, because there's multiple rationales at play, and the ritual of belonging one among them. So taking this ritual of belonging idea seriously, I think means taking seriously the question of what it is that we want to belong to, what world we want to make through our reaching out, to grapple with the terms of inclusion in those worlds. If there are multiple pathways to a global world, planetary belonging and belonging to membership in elite networks or legitimization within them, I think we want to ask about the extent to which that points to multiplicity or heterogeneity within those global networks that can be activated, deactivated, accessed, frankly, shaped and manipulated. In other words, directed in ways we might prefer over ways we might not prefer. Let me next say something quickly about values. In education policy, one of the traditional definitions of policy is that it's the authoritative allocation of values. And in some ways, what this presentation kind of is getting into is the question of what values are being authorized in a decision to participate or not in an international large-scale learning assessment. There's definitely an exercise of authority allocating values. At the same time, education policy analysts in more recent years have invited us to examine how authority is allocated to policy. And of course, it would seem that participation in an ILSA allocates authority to the ILSA. On one level, participation is binary. Sure, you either do the test or you don't do the test, although sometimes you can get disqualified if you do it wrong, which raises interesting questions. But what Camila's work shows us is that the binary yes or no of participation doesn't mean one clear thing, right? Participation means different things in different settings, right? That there's a polyvalence of the meanings that we act and shape. And again, I would say perhaps this attention to the multiple rationales of key actors can be taken as an invitation to examine the multiple and varied ways that authority is allocated to international assessments. In other words, it's not simply by participating or not. I think a lot resides in how and why the participation occurs and how it's structured. So again, returning to the fact that tomorrow here in this city, the 2018 PISA results are going to be released. And her challenge to us, how should we, what is this thinking about the politics of participation in the first place, let alone what's going to happen with the results? Okay, what is that? How might that shape and affect how we think about the data we're going to be inundated with tomorrow? I think Camila's work here invites us to investigate all the hopes and fears and objectives that are laden into PISA participation. Surely the multiple purposes of PISA will shape its future, right? Because I think right now, there are a lot of questions about the future of PISA. And the answers to those questions are going to be determined by this multiple play of reasons that people participate in PISA. And of course, what happens with the results is the second part. So I think a couple specific questions occur to me that I'll close with. One, and this is maybe a research question, but I think people can speak in the audience from online. This is an interesting invitation to think a little bit about how the reasons for participating in PISA might shape the politics that emerge around the results. Kind of using that as a variable to try and understand the meaning and the multiple meanings that are made of PISA. And I would also again ask, what does this strong argument? Now she could have found the opposite, right? Let's remember that. She could have discovered, actually, you know what? There's really one reason why people do PISA, but she didn't, which is important, right? But so what does this multiplicity of reasons for participating in PISA portend for the future, right? Will it actually lead to the kind of elasticity and flexibility that will keep it and other ILSAs going? Or might we reach a tipping point where there's too many objectives freighted into PISA and other tests, that people start looking elsewhere for answers to the right kinds of science that are going to direct education policy, and the right kinds of ways in which we can accredit institutions and programs. So I will close with that. And again, thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Noah. Let's give him a round of applause. Thank you very much for those very thoughtful comments. Would you like to respond? So I'd like to open the floor. I have some questions that have come in through our online audience. And of course, since I have the microphone, I have a question of my own as well. So there are a couple of questions that relate where it's clear people are struggling for help related to ILSAs and wondering what is out there. So there are a couple of questions related to that. But there are others about a very interesting one here. Has any study been done on countries' use of assessments and as it relates to mental health issues? You may know that or not. And I would like to push you to say a bit more if your research has anything to do with this, if you've investigated or if you plan to do something on forms of resistance and the consequences of resistance. I think that would be interesting to know about.
Thanks, Sue. Thanks, Noah, for great questions you've raised. So I'm very sorry to say, but on the mental health issue, I really don't know of any research that relates to that, but possibly there is, but maybe it occurs in health studies and I'm not aware of it. As regards resistance, that's a very interesting question. Not that I've done research on it, and not that I'm aware of a lot of research on ILSA resistance. Obviously, there's the opt-out movement, which has been studied, for example, by Bob Lingard and his colleagues, which is very interesting. Who is opting out? Who is resisting this testing culture? But I have been invited on multiple occasions to be an activist in resistance movements to ILSAs, in particular from different people working in education across the Latin American context, maybe because that's where I know a number of people and that's where I've been doing research. But I am aware that there are a lot of people who feel and who are trying to resist and trying to organize that resistance, which in part also occurs in the academic world, as we've seen with the letter that was published by a group of scholars in The Guardian a number of years ago, which was a sort of resistance to the OEC. The PISA work, there's also been, let's say, different forms of resistance. I remember at one stage the European Parliament was invited by Poland to make a strong statement against the spread of international large-scale assessments, which then found a lot of support from many other European countries, which asked the European Parliament to actually make a strong statement, which it did do. And warned against the narrowing and the teaching to the test sort of impact of international testing. So there are different shapes and forms of activism or resistance towards this testing. This educational world, which is being turned into a tested domain.
Thank you. I think it would be interesting to learn more. I'm thinking particularly of the more vulnerable countries that feel the pressure to participate, and if they don't, is financing tied to it? Given the big push for certain forms of evidence to inform decision making, and maybe there's because it calls into question, is it a perceived, could it undermine some of the rationales if we actually had research on the experience of countries who do resist and what consequences they faced?
and I think this relates to the rationales for non-participation or withdrawal. It's interesting where there has been most resistance, at least in terms of what's been shared with me, is resistance towards what is known as PISA for 5-year-olds. That does raise a lot of issues and has created resistance both in academic communities but also in governments, us really pushing back.
The floor is open, so we'll pass the microphone. Oh, there we go. We have one on the far side. And would you do us all a favor and introduce yourself? Thank you.
Hello, my name is Siddharth Santosh, and I'm a student of the Masters in Public Policy program at Sciences Po here in Paris. The question that I have for you after today's wonderful presentation is for countries, I'm from India, and for countries that do not participate in exams like in assessments like PISA, do you think they've continued to make their national level assessments better, or have they just not chosen to, go ahead with large scale assessments at all?
We'll take a couple questions. I think Richard Sack also had his hand up. Sorry. You can introduce yourself.
Richard Sack. I'm fascinated by the fact that in all of these rationales you've reported, nobody talks about, or at least not directly, pedagogy, learning, teaching, and which one would think is presumably the product or a major end product. Sue said that IIP's concern here is the use of these tools. So none of these rationales appear to me in any case to be directed towards the teaching and learning processes, which makes me ask you if you've gotten into perverse effects, the perverse effects of PISA usage. You mentioned just a minute ago, you alluded just a minute ago of teaching to the test. I mean, there's a sort of, I don't know how well known it is, a so-called law in sociology, Campbell's law, that's something to the effect that any metric in related to social decision making becomes corrupted as it is increasingly used. And here the example would be tests are needed. They can be very useful, be they high stakes for the individuals or assessment tests for systems, but they can be perverted. And one of the examples of that is teaching to the test. And then another question is concerning the demand for PISA. You mentioned that also. How is the demand generated? I mean, I've seen it quite a number of times at the ground level. It's generated by international organizations, be it the World Bank or the GPE or UNICEF or what have you, in discussing financing an educational sector program or what have you. Do you have an assessment? Is there a PISA in the country? Is there an EGRA in the country? What do we know about this? And in this case, of course, the idea is that it be related to policy making, policy decision making concerning the allocation of resources and perhaps more down-to-earth pedagogical actions. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Let's turn back to our speaker.
Yeah, okay. So first, about national large-scale assessments where ILSAs are not taking grasp. I can't talk for India. I don't know the case specifically. I do know that in the case where, for example, both Kenya and Morocco were attempting to take part in LAMP, and then they came to the decision that actually it wasn't serving their purposes, they interrupted participation. They withdrew, although they were part of the process for quite a period, and they developed something of their own, which to a certain extent drew on what they had learnt, but also allowed them the flexibility which was not being given to them. In the case of South Africa, their withdrawal was also to do with wanting to work much more with their national assessments. So I can't say universally, but I would assume that where there's non-interest or just or sort of rejection of international large-scale assessments, that governments would be seeking to develop their own instruments. As regards your question, Richard, it's very interesting. I do believe that to a certain extent, this prestige or this global stage, this international space that is attached to international large-scale assessments has eclipsed the pedagogy, the curriculum, everything that is part of the way in which ILSAs are sold as instruments to improve education. Very rarely is there any reference to using ILSAs to change pedagogy, to change curriculum. And when it is, there's also a question of to what extent can it be used in that way. We know that the link between PISA and curriculum is very, very loose. In the case of TIMSS and PEARLS, probably it's much more possible, but I don't know much about that. So yes, nice that you pointed it out, because I didn't say this, but indeed this dimension of the purposes of ILSAs is eclipsed by all these other rationales, all these different meanings, no? And who knows, maybe teachers or those who are involved in actually thinking about the everyday pedagogies and curriculums and the textbooks are looking and bring different interests into ILSAs once the decision to participate has been taken. And then on your question on how the interest generated, that's an interesting point. Because, for example, in the case of PISA for Development, I know that tickets and hotels and everything has been paid to invite government representatives to come and participate in these luxurious events and to present why they would like to participate in PISA, or why they're not thinking about it quite yet. In some way an allure of come and be part of this community. And in some cases, it does lead to then the government deciding that it will participate. And so, yes, there is often a case of interest in the initial sort of triggering maybe occurring with the help of international organizations, in particular the ones which are trying to grow the number of participating countries. But then I think that that interest is appropriated. It becomes what do we want out of it? So although there may be pressure or there may be sort of invitation, I think then it's digested into what does it mean for us? Where is it taking us?
Thanks. Let me turn to the online audience and share a couple of questions from there. One member says, large-scale tests may not reflect the local context. How can we compare one context to another, since education is a total of individual competence influenced by many factors? So I'm not sure your research is focused at all on this, but understanding the many dimensions that influence performance in a single assessment. And are there assessment implementation guidelines that support implementation of assessments, things to guide educators on the messaging and best practices? And then finally, somebody wants to come back to the resistance and wants some guidance on how can the public be engaged in a critical and complex discussion around the politics of ILSAs, which are often simplified in public as rankings and league tables, as we will see this week. So they're a bit quite outside your scope, but both of you are welcome to try to suggest some resources.
Okay. So first of all, if they don't reflect the local context, how can we compare? I think the question is, what's the purpose of comparing? And the answer of what the purpose of comparing, whether it's to learn new pedagogical approaches, whether it's to understand what's being done differently, that would explain how to compare. Otherwise, I'm not quite sure what the purpose of comparing is. In the case of international large-scale assessments, I wouldn't say that it's fully about informing policy, and I think that it serves other purposes. I think I'm the wrong person to be asked about the guidelines on how to support implementation. I'm sure everything is there and even more, but I'm not the right person to give that information. And in terms of how can the public engage in that resistance or be more informed and more aware, first of all, I think on the one side, there's a duty on the part of scholars who work on international large-scale assessments to make our research available, for example, in contexts like this one, but also, and it's not an easy conversation. It tends to happen in silos. There is the academic groups, there are the media and so forth. But there is the possibility of organizing oneself, as has the opt-out movement in the United States, in the UK, in Italy, I'm not an activist, but I'm sure that there are many ways of mobilizing movements around something that is so strongly felt, as, for example, ILSAs. Do you want to add something, Noah?
Just quickly, I appreciate the question about comparing contexts. However, I would say if you take the PISA data sets, they're fascinating. They're interesting to work with. And I think we can point to some, insightful work that's been done on the basis of them. We can also point to some really non-insightful use of the results. So that raises, in and of itself raises the question of the overall value. But I personally am committed to seeing some value in some of this. I would say though that I don't know. I have this feeling that we're at a moment where there's a bit of a reckoning on the horizon, where there's perhaps an awareness that we've freighted, meaning we've layered so many objectives into these international large-scale assessments that there's an increasing awareness that they just can't deliver that. So I'm actually quite interested and concerned about what are the next steps. Will there be? Are we about to experience PISA fatigue? You'll say that's impossible based on what's going to happen the next couple of days. I wonder though. I wonder if the OECD is experiencing some fatigue, and I wonder what'll come next and what the role of ILSAs will be in all of that.
Okay, let's go back to the audience here. I have a question, two questions here, and a third one over there. Again, please introduce yourself.
Hi, Pablo Martin Calvo from Spain, former teacher, education consultant. I have a question about a last event that happened in Spain. I'm sure you're aware of. They have retained the results from PISA on reading because of some problems with the tests themselves. And that makes me ask myself about individual rationale to participate in these tests, since they don't have any academic effect, they don't have any consequence for the public. What do they mean for individuals that actually participate in the test? Not only the students, but also teachers and school administrators. I don't know, the individuals that actually have to implement the test. And yeah, and in your view, what do ILSAs say about the objectives of the education system? Because since most of these assessments are focused on learning outcomes, are we saying that the objective of the education system is just to teach something that can be measured this way, or are there other objectives that could be simply to keep people in school as long as possible? And I know there are several objectives that can relate to social, mental issues, broader objectives than just learning outcomes.
Okay, I am Antoni Verger from the Autonomous University of Barcelona. Thank you, Camila, for a great presentation, and Noah for the comments. And well, what you describe for ILSAs, I think has a lot of parallelisms with what we observe at the national level with national large-scale assessments. And these undesired effects of ILSAs are
have been very much actually studied at the national level with all this teaching to the test, narrowing the curriculum, standardization, and so on. And as a reaction to this, policymakers have started talking more seriously about, okay, we need to promote more formative national assessments, more intelligent accountabilities that focus on educational processes, on the effort that teachers are putting to improve education independently of the final outcomes. So are you familiar with transposition of this debate of intelligent accountabilities to the global scale through ILSAs? Or in other words, how an intelligent ILSA should look like?
Yeah, thank you for this presentation. I'm Hugues Moussy, I'm the head of research and development here at IEP. I've got two questions, and I think they're related. I hope they are related. The first one is that what we clearly see through what you through your presentation, but also your article, is that in the global education landscape, I think as learning assessment, especially ILSAs, are really key features where we see a very strong link between policy and politics. I think you explained that very clearly. And I'm wondering if you would say that in a way, when we take especially some of the two rational categories that you have, the technical and the political one, if you could say that from the origins, let's say in the 1980s, when OECD decided to think about, developing these kind of assessments, especially under the pressure, I think, of the US and France too, others probably too. Is it a way, would you say that it's a way we could frame this into, what Ferguson called the anti-politics machine? So you kind of develop these very strong technical assessments that are very scientifically exposed and so on. And that's a way to depoliticize some debates, but also to bring your own politics inside, whatever this politics is. And if I take the example that I read, I'm wondering if it's one of your articles about how France in 1988, 99 wanted to develop a strong reform in education, but thought that it wouldn't be accepted within the broad audience or the public, and they needed this kind of precise scientific data to go through it. And it's one of the origins of PISA. So how would you consider, both of you, that it would be, go well within the frame of Ferguson's anti-politics machine? And the second one is really a question, because we have a research project on learning assessment data in sub-Saharan African countries. And it's a political economy approach. So we also ask people about the resistances, who supported the introduction of large-scale assessment and who opposed them. And what we begin to hear that is that a lot of people, decision makers, but not only, point out to teachers who resist that. And we hear that also from a number of teachers. So I'm wondering whether you have more information, there is more research on who really resists. You said that there were not that much, especially on behalf of teachers. And also how we could link both, how in a way this very externally developed econometrical way of measuring education success with non-formative but summative assessments would be a way, it's a question to have, in a way, depoliticize the discussion and dialogue with teachers in some countries.
Do you want to take any?
I'll say something about heat at the end.
Okay, great. So first to Pablo's question on what's in it for individuals, teachers, students, schools. Very good question, especially because it's summative. What is it in there for them to take out of it? And I think that issue has been brought to the table a number of times. What do students get out of it, given students, teachers, the immense effort that's put into it? No, I mean, for example, in the United States, students are paid a small amount to participate, which many people have questioned how this different effort is remunerated. How does this play into the actual data that we have at the end of the day? So it's a good question, and I think that a number of scholars have raised this question, and I think that teachers and heads of schools and students continue to raise this question. And interestingly, as you bring up the issue with Spain, so I've only read one article about it, but my perception from what I read was that there was a form of resistance. I don't know more than that, but the sort of patterns that they've identified in the way that has made the data not valid would assume that there's some kind of decided or collective that has decided to resist a certain part of the test, which would indicate a sort of that there isn't something in it for the students, at least as what they're trying to push back on. What do ILSAs say about the objectives of education? This is an interesting question in the sense that, let's say until the 1980s or so, data was collected on the basis of questions that were asked. So we started from a research question and then gathered the data. And now we find ourselves in an age where the same happens with big data, and ILSA's data is not big data, but with big data and with ILSAs, we collect immense amounts of data and then we ask questions. So the problem with this is that once you've collected data, you've already framed it, because obviously it shapes, it has an infrastructure to it. Decisions are taken about what the objectives of education are, for example, because otherwise how are you going to develop your instruments? So I would say that the objectives of education are already embedded in the data. There's only so far that you can go in suggesting alternative objectives when it's already collected and framed, which is why I think that it's very important to start from a research question rather than from the data. Tony, I love this idea of intelligent ILSAs. And I didn't know about what you're saying here about national large-scale assessments, where having identified what's happening, they're trying to move to assessments that are that focus more on the process, that can stop what's happening in national large-scale assessments. One, I don't know if this is happening in ILSAs, but I would also ask whether that would be in the interest of ILSAs, as opposed to national large-scale assessments that I understand as being much more oriented towards understanding education, because they allow for a level of detail in the analysis which is much deeper and which really allows you to in relation to the context, to inform policy decisions and practices. In the case of ILSAs, to me, the feeling is that it is not oriented towards changing practices in that way, but it's about the power that it carries, the legitimacy that you can use it for. But it's a fascinating question, and I would like to know more about if there is a shift towards thinking about how ILSAs can become more intelligent. And then on the final questions too, shall I take the first and you the second, or?
Sure, go for it.
Okay, so, I mean, in science and technology studies, we wouldn't separate politics and technical matters. I have separated them here as I was not using the science and technologies approach. But in science and technology studies, politics is science by other means. Is that the way around? Yes. In other words, yes, this idea that we create a strong assessment so that we can depoliticize it, so that we can bring in new politics. Absolutely, this is, I think, very much which is what is happening. And I didn't bring this into my speech, but what I wanted to talk about is the appeal and the attractiveness of the way in which PISA is presented has also a lot to do with the way in which it's created, the instruments, the way in which it's presented as something that requires secrecy because the test items can't be shared and so forth, allows decisions to be taken which are actually highly political decisions. And they are afterwards presented or clouted with objectivity, impartiality, the political instruments, when we know very much that they are deeply political, and that's the way in which they've been able to protect that political dimension and justify it as occurring, as being or just clouting it with scientificness. Actually, it's I believe that to a certain extent it contributes to the sort of tidiness and cleanliness and objectivity with which ILSAs derive attractiveness from. That doesn't respond entirely to your question. I'll see what now I can do.
I agree, except I want to suggest we might be turning a corner on that with an increasing recognition of ILSAs as highly politicized, both in what comes when they're released and, as you are responsible for showing us, also in their composition in the first place. But I don't think that means that we can expect any shift away from the search for neutral, objective, depoliticized, scientific knowledge that could inform educational decisions. I hope not, but I wonder where we're going to turn to find those, and what the voices are going to be that direct that. I think you usefully brought up big data. It's useful to think a little bit about, we're in a scientific measurement process that was put into place in the 70s and 80s, right? When I see the claims that are made about machine learning and artificial intelligence, you don't even, as Camille is pointing out, you don't even need a research question. Just go in and do pattern recognition, and that'll help you figure out what to teach and how to teach it. I think that has increasingly accepted coherency and authority attributed to it. And I would also put on the table neuroscience. I think, if there is some fatigue with international large-scale assessments, we want to pay close attention to where people turn for something to serve similar purposes.
Okay. Are there any other questions? No? Well, I would encourage everyone in the room, given the level of interest, to keep reading, keep investigating. The slides are online, and the last slide has a number of references, I think, and several of the slides actually have references. In the back of the room, we have a number of publications that relate to international learning, large-scale assessments. There's this very recently published piece, which Camilla was the reviewer for, The Promise of Large-Scale Learning Assessments, and it tries to look critically at some of the pros and cons and where we might go. And there are some working papers from the Education Research and Foresight section of UNESCO. And of course, stay tuned. Those of you who are interested in IEP's research on the use of learning assessment data in ministries of education in sub-Saharan Africa, Hugues Germain, he'd be very happy to speak with you. So in the meantime, it is my great pleasure to invite everyone here in Paris to come upstairs and have a cocktail. Please join me in thanking Camilla Addy and Noah Sobey for a really stimulating discussion this evening. Thank you very much. Thank you to our online audience.